YouTube. I don't know how many of you will actually be watching, but I just thought I would start a rather arbitrary video to talk about some geopolitical developments for about an hour, probably about an hour, maybe an hour and a quarter. We're also cross-streaming on Clubhouse, which is quite cool. So if you like your audio only, you should check out Clubhouse. Yeah, so just setting up here. If you're new to my channel, if you're new to my rooms, welcome to those of you joining. My name is shorturl. I am there's a lot of stigma, I think, these days against experts and such. But generally speaking, I am a sort of national policy nerd, so I work on international relations related things and generally sort of current affairs, predominantly to do with climate change. And with this room, I just kind of wanted to talk about some of the main geopolitical current contemporary events that have gone on in the past week or so. So if you're joining from Clubhouse, welcome as well. We are actually cross-streaming this on YouTube at the same time, experimenting with a few different things, because I did recently launch a YouTube channel to sort of see if anyone actually enjoys it. I'm not very good at doing it, but we shall persevere and sort of learn in the process. If you don't mind retweeting or resharing this space if you're on Clubhouse, and leaving a comment if you're on YouTube, and please, that'd be more than welcome. For those of you listening on Clubhouse, if you actually want to see my head, as in see my face, see who's actually doing the talking, you can find that above now. I might try and rechange the title, because I think multi-streaming with Restream, which is one of these restreaming platforms, is not a great title, but if not, no worries. But yeah, so the goal with this is just to try something a little bit new, a little bit different. I'm probably going to just go through some of the main articles in the past couple of days and sort of just share my perspectives. And if those of you on Club can come up and add your comments, ask a question, whatever it is, then please do. I found particularly of note the comments around the unilateral ceasefire with Russia, something we should probably start with. So even President Putin attempted to unilaterally declare a ceasefire, which, well, being the invading force doesn't work. You can call a ceasefire, but it's highly unlikely you're going to be able to actually enforce it or for it to be taken seriously, because why would you, as the invading force, want to declare a ceasefire? Unless really there are ulterior motives to that. As I say, you can actually see my screen on YouTube. If you check it out above, you can see I'm sharing the article that I'm talking about. So the Ukrainians marked Jan 6th, Jan 7th is the Orthodox Christian Christmas, of which I'm actually baptized Russian Orthodox, but it's not a religious thing at all for me. It's more just because of my Russian heritage. And Putin wanted to basically unilaterally order a pause in these, a reprieve in the attacks. Ukraine, unsurprisingly, ultimately rejected it almost immediately, which was the duration was supposed to be 36 hours, which is not really long enough for it to be a genuine ceasefire, which is why they didn't bother sort of doing it either. And Zelensky and the United States particularly were quick to come out and say this is all bollocks. So can I say bollocks on YouTube, or will I be sort of demonetized and in trouble? Probably. If you're just joining, we are cross-streaming this. I'm doing something new for once, trying video streaming as well as YouTube, Clubhouse and stuff. So if you want to check out the YouTube stream, you can see my face. Hello, if you're watching on there. But yeah, so the Russian Defense Ministry insisted its forces were going to observe the ceasefire from about 9 p.m. yesterday, British time, and then but added that its army had repelled attacks by Kievan forces apparently in the east and had killed thousands of Ukrainian soldiers on Friday. Once again, I find this relatively hard to believe. What I do find interesting, though, as this article also points out, is that it's via Facebook. For some reason, Russia seems to be particularly usage of Telegram and Facebook, despite some of those having, limitations. A lot of the social media giants have pulled out of the country, and so there's very little usage by the Russians for these social media tech companies. So I mean, just. They shelled a lot. I mean, it's one word against another. The Russians claim one thing. This is why I'm using dghHZ, because it's a non-Western source. It's owned by Qatar, and Qatar have decent relations with the Russians, I guess you could say. The Gulf, the Middle East, more broadly, hasn't really imposed flight restrictions, asset freezes, or any real sort of sanctions on Russia. Like the West has, NATO, or countries like Singapore, Japan, South Korea, or Australia, for example. I think using our information to talk about things, I reference as well, like the BBC or AP. Read sometimes the Russian media outlets just for a sort of shift in perspective. Once again, if you're on Clubhouse and you want to join the stage, you're more than welcome. Raise his hand and I'll bring you up. It's a bit of a sort of arbitrary, chilled out Saturday evening, probably for about another hour before I probably head out for the evening. But so as I say, the unilateral ceasefire declaration was never going to be observed by one side. Equally, because the Ukrainians have the upper hand, this comes in the back of the fact that about 80 Russian individuals were killed, mainly military men or servicemen, who were using their phones, according to different sources, on a military sort of compound area, I think it was, and basically that was in range of the Ukrainian forces. They could tell where they were, they could pinpoint their location. Basically, they just took them out. So that's I think that's been a bit of a wake-up call to the Russians in a way that we haven't seen for a while. And basically, if we think back to March or April, this is something I said in another room a few days ago, which is that at the beginning of the war, the Russians didn't really care about the losses because Russia was, they thought they were still going to win. And most of us thought they were going to flatten the Ukrainians, but actually they didn't. They, here we are. But so it didn't really matter to the Russians if some of their troops died, if the radio broadcasts, transmissions between regiments, battalions, whatever, was public. They weren't that bothered as long as it didn't jeopardize the ultra strategical goals. The Russians weren't too fussed about the tactical sort of inefficiencies and shortcomings of them, of their concepts and stuff. Now, though, this is becoming because Ukraine is not only making a significant amount of progress in the conflict, but it's also, beginning to target more, at least incrementally, the territory. And that's an immediate, obviously, threat. It's no longer the war is not contained within Ukraine. It's a cross-border conflict. And this is a huge concern for Russia at this point. And I think has changed the calculus in the Kremlin. And you've seen Putin potentially pushing for this sort of, shift in narrative, shall we say. But what's also notable, and again, what I'm drawing out in this article, if you want to check out the article, check out the YouTube stream on Clubhouse, is that Putin was actually, he attended his service on his own. It was him and the Russian patriarch, I always forget how to pronounce that, basically the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, sort of were basically themselves on their own together sort of embracing and experiencing or sort of acknowledging the Russian Orthodox Christmas. To quote Putin, he said, "It's deeply gratifying to note the enormous constructive contribution of the Russian Orthodox Church and our Christian denominations," interesting use of words there, "in unifying society, preserving our historical memory, educating youth, and strengthening the institution of family." Putin really doubling down on this rhetoric of, traditionalism, conservative values. He had to normalize, as we saw about a week ago at the comments that he gave on New Year's in front of sort of that group of people in military fatigues, if you saw it, basically really trying to normalize the idea of militarization, a wartime economy, and sort of basically, instead of trying to argue that we're going to wind down our involvement in the conflict, simply try and get away with normalizing it in the minds of the Russian people, so that legitimizes his ability to sort of continue to fund the war, basically. What's interesting in another article I read was that the oligarchs are Russian oligarchs who are more ultra-nationalist, and the ultra-nationalists within the shall we say Russian political system are on the fence about sort of how much they want to see another remobilization. So we had the mobilization, partial in quotation marks because it's not really, it's much larger potentially, done in September, but there's now a growing sort of small but still notable resistance to a second round of mobilization, because for what that would mean for more Russian commitment. So far, this 300,000 forces hasn't really made much of a difference. I mean, the Ukrainians continue to make incremental gains, and whilst there's been bloody fighting around Bakhmut, for example, it's still very much, I would say, the momentum remains most recently with the Ukrainians. What's also interesting, just referring back to the Al Jazeera article here, was the Ukrainians celebrated, obviously, Orthodox Christmas, but it was delivered in Ukrainian, not Russian, for the first time in decades, which is another illustration of how the Ukrainians are trying to distance themselves, or as the article uses the word, jettison Moscow's remaining influences over various non-military or sort of political areas, so religious, cultural, and even economic. Moreover, you've seen a departure or a deviation, a separation between different parts of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And Ukraine has actually allowed, I think for the first time also the year, for there to be for Ukrainian Orthodoxies to celebrate on December 25th, so the Georgian calendar, instead of the forget the name of the name of the well, my brain is not working this afternoon or night, of the Orthodoxy one. I forget the name of the Gregorian calendar and the other calendar that defines the Russian Orthodoxy one. So it's they are trying to diversify in Ukraine and sort of normalize this balance of Westernization or Western sort of interpretation of religion and things like Christianity, whilst also sort of accepting that there are obviously those strong remnancies of Russian and sort of Slavic. The US called the unilateral ceasefire a quote cynical ploy. They also yesterday announced another $3.7 billion in defense aid to Ukraine, which brings the overall defense to, I think, over 100 billion at this point, sizably more. It's and after just to bring in the US element a bit more, obviously, finally, after sort of 300 years worth of votes, Kevin McCarthy was finally brought into the House as Speaker. I know it wasn't that long, but still, like, geez, like a week of 15 rounds, like, come on, guys. That doesn't bode well for the ability for the House to pass legislation and policy. I mean, the Republicans more broadly want to investigate Biden and the family, and I think that's going to keeping on the Ukrainian front trickle into the amount of money that is given to Ukraine, provided. So I would watch that space as well over the next few weeks, because up until they choose a Speaker of the House, they can't actually pass any legislation, they can't do policy, and whilst you need both the House and the Speaker and the Senate, to do stuff, it's the House is the one that predominantly drives that initial discussion around it. And because the Republicans have now taken over, a lot of people, I think, expect there to be a shift in the willingness to supply Ukraine just outrightly. Alex, welcome. I'll bring you up. And if you're on YouTube, I hope you're leaving some comments. I'm not very good at doing all this sort of stuff. But yeah. So that's sort of where, Alex, how are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. How about you?
Good. Just cross-streaming to YouTube and Clubhouse simultaneously for a little bit of a different experience. So, yeah. What do you think on the current matter?
I was laughing about the many, 15 times the charm, whatever, of the McCarthy vote. It was very funny and also very sad because there weren't really other candidates that had any traction. But it was this is a tendency that I see more and more in around the world, especially more as we move further toward the right in many populist countries, like countries that are moving towards populism. But this is basically the end of this idea that you don't bring problems, you bring solutions. So right now we seem to be mired in this, just pointing out problems. Problems is really not helpful. Most people know what problems exist, and they know maybe not that they'll do, but they know that there are problems. That we have is that people are voting on problems, but nobody's offering solutions. So I really see as a large trend in individuals and in groups and groups that this is something where somehow saying no without having an alternative has become an acceptable solution, and it's really not a solution. All it does is entrench the problem, and I really do wish that we had some sort of cultural shift where it was no longer primary goal to say things like never anyone, right? It doesn't, anyone is a useless thing. That's like just saying, no, I don't like that option. Okay, the alternative. No, I just not that one. There's still a universe of possibilities and no sense of direction of where to go with that particular problem. And so that is, I would love to put like a moratorium on anybody saying no without offering an alternative. And it has to be a reasonable alternative. So for all of the people who are voting no to McCarthy, and boy, there are a lot of reasons why you want to do that. They weren't really offering reasons for alternative ideas. And that's what gave him the room to do 15, 16. So, it's crazy to do that. But that's like, if you're not going to say, okay, we don't want him because, and now we want to offer our own alternative, then he would not have gotten so many votes. But this is, a very weak solution to this, speaker race. This is clearly just naked efficient, right? This is not somebody who has a strong indication of what his ethical code is and what his political standing is. He's literally just saying, all right, here's what I believe. You know what? Screw it. What do you want me to do?
Yeah.
And I'll do it. And using his concessions, that's exactly what he did. So anyway, I just...
No, not at all. I think those, I wrote a piece about this on Substack, actually. One of the things I do a weekly, what I call geopolitical, pretty generic name, but I wrote 3 things that I look out for each week, and so much of what's happening next week in the US, i.e. the first order of business of the 118th Congress, was completely dominated by, looking back at this farcical week where we've had Republicans, not the Democrats were sitting on their asses reading books because they're so fed up with the infighting from the Republicans. And I thought it was really interesting, that we almost saw an altercation conversation between one of the other Republican individuals and Matt Gaetz. I don't know how to pronounce his surname. Until the speaker is elected, none of these people are actually officially representatives. They're all elects. So business can't begin until the speaker is chosen. So you guys have basically lost about 4 days worth of business, and legislating and doing the actual thing that people in the House are supposed to do. Moreover, this is, I think, the worst time that it's like this since like sometime in the 1800s, like when it took 44 rounds or something. So it's really bad. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Just to reset for everyone who's joined on Clubhouse, welcome. This is my first sort of, weekly experimental. If you click on the above, you'll see a YouTube link, and it will take you to my YouTube channel, which I launched a week ago. And you can see my face. So if you want to listen to me and look at my delightful hotel room that I have here, which is pretty generic, it's blurred out. But if you want to watch me on YouTube, you can do so. It's a bit laggy. I'm going to be switching to a better platform, but I'm just trying this out to see what it's like. And if you want to subscribe, that'll be much welcomed. I'm going to be doing a lot more video podcasting going forward this year. I'm just trial and troubleshooting and mucking around with the different stuff, but I thought I'd just cross stream into Clubhouse as well, so that we can have a chat. If you want to come up on Clubhouse, then please do. Alex, thank you for making me less lonely on stage. But the other thing I wanted to do was actually just talk a little bit about Iran, because the situation in Iran has obviously gotten has I wouldn't say it's subsided, but it's not been in the news as much in recent weeks. And the Iranian, the Islamic Republic basically executed another two young activists today. Obviously, it was condemned by multiple different groups, but this is a important phase of the rebellion. Is how I'm calling it. It's more than a protest, but it's not yet really a full-scale revolution, because revolution is technically, I'm being very technical and academic here, but revolution is technically when it succeeded. It has revolutionary movements or aspects to it, but I prefer to use the word rebellion just because it's still quite unorganized. There isn't a clear leader. There isn't a clearly militarized group on the opposing side. It's still civilians versus the government or regime, and the military have yet to get really involved and take sides. What we have seen shift is the increased amount of general strikes that are necessary element, because it shows that people are more willing to just come out on the streets, protest, and forego going to work, earning money, earning a livelihood to sustain their families and themselves. So we're still in a delicate phase at the moment, because if you look back to 1979 and some of the real, tumultuous moments, the regime and other oppressive governments would impose such methods. They would utilize executions as a way to instill fear and try to force the capitulation of the population. And in times that worked, but at the moment it's not working. I mean, it's not that in the 80s, I forget the term for what they were called, but they thousands of people were executed, political prisoners, opposition, journalists, activists, particularly women, as well. So we haven't reached that scale yet, but I think the regime is incredibly well constructed, and it's, they are definitely agitated, but it doesn't remain clear. They haven't even begun, basically, is what I'm saying, to fully implement some pretty draconian and oppressive uses if they wanted to. Like, as I say, the military hasn't gone involved. Clearly, the IRGC, which is the Revolutionary Guard, a particular special branch of the military, would be loyal to the regime because they were actually created by the Islamic Republic. But the general broader military, not clear. It's basically. And I was actually interviewed in a news article that was released today on this. But basically, what I said was that rebellions or revolutions are sprints, not marathons. Sorry, marathons, not sprints. The 1979 revolution took over 18 months, just FYI. So this one's been 4 months. And while I hope it can succeed, because I would like nothing more than for Iran to be free and the Iranian people to be living as they wish, we've still got a long way to go. And then there's obviously the role about, does the West support the Iranian people? Do we get more involved? The British actually moved a quite important moment, which is to recognize and designate the IRGC as a terrorist organization, which is quite significant. They've already done this with the morality police and things, but we've still got a long way to go in certain things. So, I will. If you use Twitter, then I've retweeted the link to the article that I was quoted in. I could read what I said, I guess. But anyway, so I remain cautiously optimistic that this revolutionary movement can sustain. But we're in an important phase at the moment, and I think that the Islamic Republic is going to take a while to overthrow them, and one begins to wonder about the people, the Iranian people. What else can we do? It's clear that the more moderate parts of the U.S. administration or system don't want there to be too much of a sort of hardline approach. They've still continued to pursue the JCPOA, the Iranian deal, despite it not having any. Well, it's and it should be bloody buried. And I used to be a fan of it because I thought I'm always open to the idea of moderacy or engagement. But these guys are not. They've lied, and it's just. They just need to be gone. Ultimately, because if you remove the Islamic Republic, a huge driver of proxy wars and proxy networks in the Middle East, you do open up the opportunity for the Middle East to have real potential constructive. I'm not saying suddenly the world's going to be perfect, but the Iranians will. Well, if you remove the Islamic Republic, basically, you could potentially see a huge cut in the amount of funding towards other, terrible groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and even the Houthi rebels are slightly different. But generally, you could see a hopeful stabilization in the region, and also just because a more moderate Iran, at least, let's just use that as a term, would at least mean that there's less tension between Saudi Arabia, between Turkey, between Israel, obviously. Because I'll quote to you what I wrote in what I said in the article, but basically, I'm concerned, and this is what I said. I don't like to think about this, but if the movement were to fail, and Khamenei, who is the current supreme leader, his regime remains, then the response from them would be terrifying, which it would be. It'd be brutal. This is the most significant set of protests Iran has experienced since 1979, much more than two, which are known as the Green Revolution, I think it was, Green Movement. And quote, if attempted resistant movements in other places are anything to go by, such as Myanmar in 2021, excuse me, after a coup overthrew the government, there would be, I think, what they're doing now. Imagine if people suddenly capitulated. How would the Islamic Republic respond? They're not going to sit like, oh, well, that was a bit of an awkward moment a few months for us, wasn't it? They're going to absolutely clamp down like no tomorrow. They would target, they would gut as many people that they felt were risks to reigniting such a movement in the future. I think you'd see an absolute dominance of the political climate, much like you've seen the Taliban basically move any of the resistance movements that we saw when they retook Afghanistan about a year and a half ago. As I say, quote here, they'd likely try identifying and targeting the people they deem to be the biggest drivers of the protests, both inside and potentially outside of Iran. And I wouldn't be surprised if parts of the diaspora's safety became concerning. Not to sound scaremongering, but what's different about the movement in Iran now is the amount of people that have been involved outside. There is a general centralized desire for not just greater women's rights or greater access to healthcare or greater economic prosperity. It's we want bloody regime change, and we want it now. And it's rare for you to see such a unified consensus between both the diaspora, who are often and anyone else, if you want to come up, please.
I do, and this is fascinating. The other street, or as you remember, I will tell you that I was on another like simultaneous street, and it your legs, and so I think that one actually worked a little bit better. I'll text. You can try that one out too, see how that works. But so the one thing, and I'm not a very I follow politics, but I don't think like my personal opinion. I try not to make my opinion the focus of the discussion. Sometimes it's unavoidable, right? But mostly it's just kind of an understanding of what is actually happening. But one of the interesting things that's happening now is right now the Netanyahu government in Israel is taking a hard right. So they've done something that I remember that occurred right after Rabin, who had initiated historic era of peace with the Palestinians, and then he was killed. And then right afterwards, there was this tunnels under the holiest sites, right under the mosques in the holiest part of Jerusalem, and it started, complete dissolving all of the peaceful intention of both sides of the population. So that seems to be the place that things happen first, right before something, not just in office, but it sort of dissolves the very trust that ever existed before. So one of the things that happened now, one of the cabinet members of Netanyahu also saying before he was put in office, and he couldn't win his opponent with the process. But now he has to have it installed, and
well, no.
Sense of outrage and outside of the Palestinians, because this is something that's kind of front, right? So now Biden has this position that he has two ways to go on, right? One is to support this clearly left, like I said, hard right turn, and the Netanyahu government. The other is to not even condemn it, but just try to stay away from it, and say that that's not something that he approves of, right? So in the U.S., this makes a huge difference which one he chooses, and this is actually what started to pull the Jewish population away from the Republican Party following Reagan. Reagan was the first to openly support Israel, gathered the Jewish population, and that actually helped quite a bit in terms of that second election. Bush pulled away, and that actually eroded a lot of his support. And right now, there's a very weird coalition of the Republican Party amongst people who ordinarily, the straight folks, who ordinarily would never be aligned. But you have evangelicals and very many a lot of together in supporting Republicans under Trump, and a lot of that was driven by his Israel support, and then the move of the embassy in Jerusalem. That was a huge move, and it consolidated power among the Jews in the U.S., and that is actually important because Jews are very active in terms of financing and driving other people to vote. So it's actually one of the key populations that, even though it's very, very small, in this especially type of election. So the issue here is if Biden decides to move in he said, I've known Netanyahu for years, we've been friends for a long time. Now, they're not really friends. Biden and Netanyahu do not like each other. And the choice here to really pull over Jewish vote if he makes towards Netanyahu, which would be incredibly helpful, obviously for him and for the people. However, it goes against most of what the world wants right now, right? Even a lot of the Jewish population that isn't politically active tends not to support extreme action, want to have this very divided state. They really just want peace. They're happy to have, let's figure out a solution. And the rest of the world is, has a very different view of Israel's role. And the Middle East takes up a huge amount of political time and dry powder.
Yeah, I mean,
it's really overall, if you're in time, it'll be interesting to see how Biden goes, because on one side, one's definitely the more politically savvy idea, and then the other one is, going really more with his prior statements of what he supports and what more the world wants.
Yeah, I think it's an important point to raise. I mean, I am absolutely opposed to Netanyahu, Bibi, to use his nickname. What's interesting is that this is a bit of I think, an anomaly in the sense of we've seen quite a veer away from many autocratic or more populist, at least on the right wing, sort of choice of leaders in the past even few months. I mean, look at Bolsonaro's loss to Lula, and a few other places in Latin America. We've seen a shift from the far right to a bit more center left. And this is obviously a deviation in the other direction for Israel. They had this coalition led by Lapid and Bennett, and whilst one of them was more moderate, another one was pretty intense. But the composition of that coalition was really interesting because they involved, one of those, Arabic parties, I forget the name, and the whole thing that basically led them to work together, wasn't it? It was because of their mutual resentment for Netanyahu, and yet this guy's back in to serve a historical state of time as prime minister, and I think this is going to be I don't know if challenge is too strong a word, but it's definitely going to be something that the Biden administration have to take into account, given also Turkey's activities in Syria. We've got a room on that next week, actually, in Twitter. If you want to join, then check out Twitter spaces for that. But yeah, Turkey's wanting to basically create a 30-kilometer incursion zone into northern Syria, with the desire of sort of repopulating some of the regions to dilute the Kurdish presence in the eastern part of the country, and just sort of create a buffer zone, obviously, between some of the more sort of cranky neck here if you're watching on YouTube. So I think that Netanyahu returning to the fray in Israel is also, to your whole point about Iran as well, just the whole volatility. Lebanon is still in a terrible situation after the past couple of years. They've never really come back from the explosion of, was it 2020 in Beirut. It's still a humanitarian disaster. So I watched the Levant, as it's known, Israel, Syria, Turkey and Lebanon, with a degree of intrigue as well. And just to the other point, Alex, I don't know if you've got anything to add on this point, was, we touched upon the house mania, shall we say, the past manicness of house shit in the past week, 5 days. And what's interesting is that yesterday, I think it was Mitch McConnell was actually, seen shaking hands with Biden at an event in his home state of Kentucky. So it does show you that the Republicans and the Democrats can cooperate. But Mitch McConnell's more of an institutionalist. He believes in making government function, and he has been able to work with Democrats on certain things. Obviously, he toes a certain line, but he's not like the 20. Who I think was designated by some Republicans as blackmailers, another guy called them terrorists, for blocking McCarthy from gaining the House role. So it shows you the various factions and alignments within the Republican Party, and why I think it's going to be really difficult, not just for the House as a whole, Democrats and Republicans, but the Republicans themselves, just to be able to get things done. I don't know how you feel about that, Alex, on the McCarthy sort of, McConnell and Biden front. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to.
I mean, McConnell is, he's basically like what I consider, and I said I wouldn't like my own opinion, but I can't help it here. So he's basically a selfish pragmatist, right? So, and that is fundamentally where he lies to go, farther right or left, and he shifts according to political will, not his own ideals, even though he touts himself as like someone who's got very strong ideals. The truth is that, he absolutely hated Trump, but then was there to support Trump not because he won, because this is before he won, not because, he had a particular idea that, McConnell realized, wait a second, this is somebody that I could support in some way. It's because he had this political will behind him, and he is literally just a pragmatist. It has nothing to do with belief. So this particular deal, right, and the reason that they were in Kentucky, which is McConnell's state, which I have a lot to say about Kentucky and the parts of the South, which is in parts of the South in the way that they vote, that was because of this infrastructure bill that came out. And a big amount of actually this bill, it says it was infrastructure, but it was the spending bill that came out, not the infrastructure bill that came out. So there must have been a typo that I read. But this is because of the spending, the huge allocation, of course, for Kentucky, as there generally is. And so he was there basically invited to celebrate this and in a show of bipartisanship. But this is not bipartisanship where I think that this rule is, there's something happening here in peace or close cooperation is more important than any sort of personal interest. This is one of these strictly, selfish, pragmatic, where what he was doing essentially was working with the Democrats primarily to get this passed, and in return he got an incredible deal for Kentucky. And that, in essence, is why a lot of Kentucky still votes for him, even though what he does with the allocations does not actually support Kentuckians, whatever. So that's what that was about. I didn't look at it as like, yay, moving, into a more bipartisan, position. If you look historically at the elected Republicans and Democrats, primarily you used to not be able to tell apart many Republicans or Democrats. And then following, Ralph Reed and then the Gingrich deal, where essentially people realized extremists vote more reliably and more often than people who are moderate. And so instead of trying to court the uncertain middle, they went to court the extremes of each party. What you ended up with is essentially, it's almost impossible to do anything in a bipartisan fashion, because it used to be there was a lot of overlap, and bipartisan voting was just something that happened naturally without any conflict. But as both sides have moved away from the moderate center and moved towards the extremes of each side, there's almost nothing in the center. So even proposed bills on each side don't come close enough to the center to allow people who are more towards the moderate edge to allow them to easily cross the aisle without angering the constituents that voted for them. And so what's left is actually this unrepresented majority. There's a huge population of people that, if you ask them not what do you consider yourself, Democratic or Republican, would consider themselves like socially liberal and fiscally conservative. That is the norm in the U.S. And there's no representation for that. So that's a lot of what is very disenchanting about politics, is that nobody seems to be really pulling for the vast majority of people who do not care what you do in the privacy of your home or your doctor's office or whatever, but they do want some sort of accountability fiscally. And there's nothing for that, because both sides are taken up by these more extreme elements that require, as you saw with Kevin, this sort of concession to some very right-wing groups or left-wing groups, like these very extremist edges, in order to pass anything. And usually those fall so far outside what the majority of the population wants that it's like, I don't even know what bills we're passing. Like, why are we doing this? I don't even understand. So that's what's happening here. Have fun. Yay, US.
Yeah, it's well, I mean, what I find really interesting is just how much all major outlets around the world are suddenly focusing on the US calamities in the House, because it's so, what happens in the House defines policy, and therefore the legislation and legislator, and therefore foreign policy sometimes, and therefore that will have implications for a lot of other countries. It's that trickle down effect, that funnel. So I think it's really interesting to see. And the altercation, as I said at the end, I was so disappointed that whoever that camera guy was who panned away from the scuffle as it was starting to focus on McCarthy. I was like, what are you doing, man? Like, stay on the altercation. I want to see some heads get kicked in. Well, no, you know what I mean? It was like, right, yeah, exactly. It was like, come on. And the Democrat that was reading a book, I think her picture went viral or something on Twitter. For those of you who check it out, it's quite funny. But yeah, just a quick point of note again, if you're joining or listening in on Clubhouse, click on the link at the top and watch me on YouTube and subscribe whilst you're at it. As I say, this is a cross stream. I wouldn't mind actually someone just jumping on the YouTube stream. I've put a question in the chat, because I want to know if people who are watching on YouTube can actually hear Alex when she's talking, or if it's only going through my headphones. And so for sort of periods that Alex is talking, you're just watching me sit in silence on the street, and I'm like, what's this guy doing? So if someone in the audience could jump onto the stream on YouTube, that'd be much appreciated, and let me know. But yeah, other than that, I think one of the other things about the Israeli factor is that Netanyahu, or Bibi, still has this ongoing bribery, fraud, and a breach of trust. Obviously, Netanyahu is like, no, I didn't do it. But there's been a fair amount of investigation into this, and it's not great that the incoming leader is, facing a huge issue, because it kind of, undermines and puts into compromise the Israeli democracy. It's the other thing that actually, just reading an article here, which you can see if you go on YouTube, you can see my screen share, so you can see what I'm reading in terms of articles. Is the Israeli opposition and civil rights groups, I think it was Human Rights Watch is one of them that I saw, have expressed alarm at just how far right this new government was. Lapid and Bennett led a pretty right-wing government, but Netanyahu has basically gone into bed with a chap called Itamar Ben-Gvir, if I'm saying that wrongly or correctly, but is known for his anti-Arab comments. He's basically outwardly anti-Arab, and has called for the relaxation of rules on when security forces could basically open fire. So public displays of protest or indifference.
Dropping in and out, so we can't actually hear what you're saying.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay. Well, yeah, I love technology. It's always working. What I was saying is that the leader of the Otzma Yehudit, or Jewish Power Party, has basically called for the relaxation of rules of when you can openly fire on people. Once convicted of incitement to racism and supporting a terrorist group, he's set to become the national security minister with authority over the police, which is great. So I expect there to be more tensions rise between Palestinian groups and Israel in the coming weeks, particularly in the West Bank, because that's where he's going to have authority over the police, particularly. The other far right part.
Did you say that he's relaxing? Sorry, did you say he's relaxing the authority, or relaxing controls basically for when he can or when you can shoot. Is that what you're saying? Or
yeah, he called for the I'll quote it from the article. He's called for the relaxation of rules on when security forces can open fire in the face of threats. Yeah. Now, face of threats is a quite arbitrary and ambiguous term. What defines threat? And you know, we've seen this happen in moments of escalation and tension in the past couple of years. You know, some groups like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have called the Israeli treatment or approach to the Palestinian apartheid. With Netanyahu coming in, it's not set to get any better.
Yeah, I think Alice Walker is the one that started discussing it originally in that particular term. And one of the interesting things that I find, I'm always surprised when people make policy decisions and don't do any research about what that policy decision has resulted in, and like other places around the world, because there's usually about that, and people are people. You know, you can see human experience. It's static and echoes because humans are humans, and we rarely change how we react to things. But invariably, whenever there's a rule that loosens the control over when police forces can shoot internally, right? This is not external military, FBI, things like that. We're talking about internal police forces on its own citizenry. Whenever there is a relaxation, and we've had several in the U.S., they exist, we've had periods of relaxation in Latin America, and in Africa, in Asia, even parts of Europe. When that happens, you invariably see a rise it's not always racist, but in discriminatory behavior by police. It almost always happens this way. So it's always it's again particular groups. It varies depending on the country, depending on the population, the tensions that exist in that country. But it continually happens whenever you allow any sort of decision making and an opening for repercussions not to exist that are harsh and immediate, right? That's usually what these releases really mean. You invariably end up with incredibly discriminatory action that occurs because the decisions that people make when they are not concerned with immediate accountability tend to rely heavily on bias. And that bias is generally not corrected in internal civilians, right? In external, like the police and military, et cetera, they're trained in particular ways, but in the U.S. and other countries, internal police are generally not vetted or trained to work against their own bias. So as soon as you say, okay, we're going to relax your concern about repercussions if you kill someone, if you harm someone, if you do whatever it is, you get immediate flares of biased actions, and it's horrible. It's very ugly. In the worst cases, it always it ends up causing a revolt of some sort, right? It causes civil disobedience, civil unrest, etc., and which is exactly the opposite of what the police theoretically are aiming for. So I do wish that people who passed rules really looked at them. I don't really care about your party or anything like that. I do wish people looked at policies and said, who else has enacted this kind of policy and what have the results been? Because one of the issues, and I am not against police at all, right? This is not about, my personal bias for or against anything. This is just historically, we can go and look and see what the statistics say. And when I see this, I always think the requirements to be a police officer most of the time don't require something like a college degree. And the issue is in college, that college experience, not the age, right? The actual experience of going to college is actually it's been linked to one of the places that most people change their bias, right? It has the greatest gun bias because it is a mixing of peer groups generally. Not every college has that experience. Not every student has that, sort of, different awakening, I guess, of their of how they view the world. But generally speaking, experience is one of the things that have lucid historic bias on an individual interactions. So without having that as a requirement and not replacing it with something else that forces interaction bias release, then this is what you get, and it can go downhill very fast. So I get concerned when I see policies like that, right? Because I would like to not have a whole bunch of unrest in the world, because that's generally speaking thing. And some people want unrest because that is going to be, all of that fomented unrest allows a previously unheard population to have its voice heard. And that I understand entirely. What I agree with the population or not, because that's what they're trying to do, using it as leverage in order to make their opinions known. But I don't think that creating situations where bias is the reason for hurt, and that's why someone's voice is heard, is a reason to do that, because they hurt. So there has to be a better way to have this heard before doing that's the only benefit, right, of this, is that it creates a level of political activism. But it's a high price to pay, in my opinion, for the better political activism.
Yeah, no, I think that's fair. I'm going to switch gears, I think, to a different topic. I'm going to bring in a climate change article. And thank you very much, SB, for helping me troubleshoot. For those of you listening in, as I say, we are cross-streaming to YouTube simultaneously. So hello to those of you on YouTube. Thank you, SB, for helping me to sort of find what I'm trying to do is whilst Alex was speaking, I was, simultaneously, of course, listening to what you're saying, but also trying to find a good distance between the computer microphone and the phone, because literally what I'm doing is just having Clubhouse next to me and playing into the stream so that people on YouTube could listen to Alex. So you've got a whole other group of people listening to you, Alex, a whole two other people. But apparently, according to SB, it sounded as though you were in tunnel on the other stream. So this is all part of the troubleshoot. So if any of you are techie and are interested in helping me figure this out, please drop me a DM and we could figure it out. The article I wanted to bring up was something I read this morning about how much wind energy generated in 2022. It's particular to Britain because BBC, but Great Britain produced a record amount of wind power last year, according to the National Grid. It came more from renewable moreover, electricity came more from renewable and nuclear power sources than from fossil fuels and gas. Interestingly, the second highest after 2020. Increasingly, the UK has actually been able to, I think it was 2 years ago, 21, where we saw more energy power for a whole day in renewables, not just how much was actually being stored as well. So obviously, renewables are significantly cheaper, which lead to cheaper bills in the long run. The problem is with this transitionatory period, when you're shifting from non-renewables to renewables, none of this happens overnight. And this is why I think when we have discussions about energy, we've got to be pragmatic about any period of energy transition, energy security. The war in Ukraine is, an underlying theme within everything, arguably now, because had Russia not invaded, then energy prices wouldn't be through the roof, and we would have a improved stability in terms of the provision. We wouldn't have to be sort of overly decoupling from Russia and sort of either having to shift to coal and other forms of non-renewables instead of oil and gas from Russia, as also sort of accelerating or trying to recklessly potentially accelerate our reliance on renewables. The UK, for example, has frankly a crappy amount of nuclear power stations, very, very poor reliance on them, compared to, say, France, which has about 75% of their energy coming from nuclear. Germany, infamous with its over-reliance on Russian sources of energy. So wind was the second highest. Nuclear at 15%, much higher than I expected, actually, for Great Britain. reason. Gas was by far just 40%, that coming from a different set of sources, including some of those in the Black Sea, North Sea, where they do still have some, although very minuscule these days, pockets of sort of, what's the word? Repositories, is that the right word? I'm not sure. They've got pockets of places in the North Sea where you've got some of the access to the oil, basically. Norway still controlling the majority of that, though. What's also interesting is that the overall daily percentage, as it shows on the screen here, for those of you watching on the stream on YouTube, it's definitely intensified, I'd say, notably after the pandemic. If anything, the global pandemic actually helped to accelerate again this shift towards non-renewables, and now we're in this discussion about this sort of the great green recovery and decarbonization. So yeah, thanks Max for letting me know. Yeah, it was. I think that's probably to do with my internet connection. Everyone, for those of you wondering, I am in Mexico. So seemingly stable Mexican connections aren't a thing. But on Mexico, actually, just as a side caveat, we do have a space on Twitter that I will be also doing probably in video format next week on the cartel calamities. So for those of you unaware, the cartel was there was a huge shootout in a northern western city of Mexico, not too far from the US border, involving the son of El Chapo, I think is the nickname, which has basically rocked quite a lot of sort of particularly Mexican, obviously, security apparatus. And I'm in Playa, which is in the eastern, it's touristy area, sort of just south of Cancun. And even in the past 24 hours, the amount of Marines, the amount of securitization I've seen of the city, of the town, grow, because obviously the cartels have a strong influence over a lot of different things. For example, a year ago when I was here, Uber was actually an option. You could actually Uber, and the cartels have basically forced Uber to disappear and for people to be reliant only on taxis, because they obviously own and influence a large array of the taxi networks. So that we're going to have that on Twitter next week with a couple of journalists and a former ambassador, actually, of Mexico to the UN, Juan Gomez. So I'm very much looking forward to that conversation as well. And also, actually, on Tuesday, looking ahead again, if you want, you can check out the Substack, which I will post in the chat. There was an interesting meeting happening on Tuesday next week about NAFTA. Well, it's the North American Alliance, basically, are meeting to discuss sort of North American issues. So North American issues sort of regarding predominantly Mexico and America, at least, immigration, a bit to do with narcotics, and we're also going to be seeing Canada and so there's a few things. If you're on Clubhouse, I've just pinned a link or added a link into the chat for the Substack article that I wrote. I don't go into as much about the North African and North American development breakdown from a British perspective, what the hell is happening with McCarthy and stuff. So if you want to check that out, go ahead. I also wrote a bit about the Orthodox Christian Christmas and then also China reopening. And last thing that I wanted to bring up, actually, and I might just use my own Substack article as reference material for this, which is that talk about repurposing material, eh? Yeah, we had a big moment, obviously, over the Christmas with the Chinese situation over COVID, and we had a conversation with this yesterday on Twitter Spaces with James Palmer, the foreign policy editor of the Chinese editor of Foreign Policy. So he's the deputy editor of the whole magazine. He writes the weekly China Brief. And we were also joined later on by Dr. Angela Rasmussen, who's a well-known American biologist, although I think she works for a Canadian university. And she was very instrumental in some of the work regarding vaccines on Ebola. from about 9 years ago. And basically, we were talking through some of the developments in the past month with China's shift away from zero COVID now to basically reopening. And it's this reopening that I wanted to just cover a little bit now, because China is, well, estimates vary really, but James, he told us during the conversation yesterday that sort of estimations are that China is experiencing 9,000 deaths a day. Again, estimates vary because the Chinese are notoriously, well, they're not going to reveal the actual data. And we have no real ability to tell what even their public health situation is like. Some people estimate that there is a need for about 230,000 extra beds in Shanghai alone. I mean, Shanghai has a population of 20 million, I think. It's massive. It's one of the largest cities in the world, largest in China. Generally, there's just a general under-provision of beds. But also, more importantly, that most public health experts like to emphasize is it's not the access to beds that's the problem. Often it's access to healthcare staff who take care of people at bedside, and undersupply of healthcare professionals, basically. We saw this in the UK, as well as a few other places in Europe during the pandemic, when the West was dealing with what China was finally dealing with, which is so basically China very under invests in its public healthcare, has tried to basically undertake this terrible zero COVID strategy, and it's now wreaking havoc, as China has, as the CCP have attempted to allow people to self-isolate at home, quarantine for a certain period, and now they want to reopen. They want to, Sunday, tomorrow, 8th of January, we'll see the country open its borders to foreigners. Most cases, though, will see Chinese nationals actually needing to test even before they get on a plane. And there is skepticism around how effective this is going to be. And also we've seen predominantly, I think, near abroad countries, so Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others, as well as the US, implement a pretty intense and restrictive, set of policies regarding Chinese nationals wanting to travel to their respective countries over the concern around subvariants that could develop from the vaccine. Thanks, Stephen, for Stephanie for coming back from YouTube, and for supporting me on that. China's obviously made points about the fact that this is an unfair sort of targeting of Chinese nationals, but and sort of using the example of Omicron. So if you cast your mind back to September, November of 2021, when Omicron appeared, initially a lot of people thought it came out of South Africa, but it actually turned out to be in Belgium, was the origins of Omicron rather. And so the sort of China's, I think, trying to put this emphasis that it's an unfair designation and restriction, without too early. But I think a lot of countries are wanting to sort of try and nip it in the bud at the moment. But there are other factors to this reopening, in that China obviously reopening for the first time properly to international travel and activity is going to want them to increase output, economic growth, and as I say here, there's a lot of questions around China's potential to experience a downturn, maybe not a full-scale recession, but a slowdown. And obviously, if there's a slowdown in China, that feeds into the global economy because of China's intricate reliance on our over-reliance perhaps on China as the sort of global workshop, I think is the term people have used. And the other thing that's interesting is that the more China wants to increase its economic activity again, I think what's going to be interesting, and if you want to join the stage, you're more than welcome on Clubhouse. Please raise your hand, and if you're on YouTube listening, then please just leave a comment, and I read all the comments, and obviously, we'll acknowledge you. If you want to come up, then please. I know I saw Tiger was listening in the comment in the audience earlier, so maybe he is sitting seething with my commentary over China, but. Clubhouse is not giving me any alerts to people raising their hands, so I don't know if that's just me. But yeah, so I'm very interested to see what this also means from the economic perspective, because China, the more China wants to increase its economic activity, that's going to require a greater increase of energy consumption. And given the precarious and absolute terrible status of energy as it is, and costs, what does this mean for basically, there's some experts. One expert I read, and just quoting my own Substack here, there's concern about China reopening too fast, because if China reopens too fast, that could lead to inflationary pressure. And what could this do to energy prices? China's use of oil and gas basically dropped significantly during the pandemic. And that will change, obviously, once they start to reopen activity and want to regain. And how could that play out into the already very volatile situation? Some options have circulated around inflation potentially leading to deflation. Deflation is far worse than inflation. And then obviously there's also this all comes off the back of US-China relations, or Chinese relations, after there was an attempt by the Biden and Xi camps at the G20 in November. The two leaders met face to face for the first time for a while to talk about their relationship, security, lots of different things. And clearly China wants to reassert itself as being back on the global stage after having been quite internally focused and dealing and grappling with the COVID situation. So they want to come back, and they have focused quite notably on diplomacy. They've focused on not necessarily just with the US, but they held some summits with some Pacific Island nations. They've attended quite a few other diplomatic engagements in the past few months. Even President Xi was in the Gulf states earlier last month, and I think that they're hosting a few other leaders as well. So China is really, I think, trying to basically just shift back to normal. But it's not going to be that easy, because other countries are looking at what's happening in China and being like, well, this isn't a normal situation, so we're not going to reciprocate, and so there could be a potential degree of contention there. The other thing that I want to point out about China-US particularly is, if you're unaware, about a week ago, there was an enormous collision, a mid-air collision between a Chinese jet fighter and a US recon plane, of which the CCP and the US gave different accounts. But unfortunately for the CCP, their account of the situation was kind of, well, I mean, I'm not going to try and say that the US was okay. I mean, they're doing reconnaissance flights around China's backyard. But basically what China said about the incident was kind of undermined, because there was a video footage, you may have seen it in the news, of this Chinese jet taken, I think, on a phone or by one of the people on board the US plane, and what the Chinese fighter jet was doing. This has happened in the past. There was a collision in 2001. From what I remember reading, which was quite problematic for relations at the time. But obviously China 20 years ago is not the China of today. And so there's a few things there that I think we need to also take into account. And the very last thing is, back to the COVID situation, is, if the estimations are even remotely true, that it's several thousand people dying a day, that's more than 3 times the peak of what was in America. So at the peak, it's about 3,300, I think, deaths a day. So either way, this is a huge humanitarian crisis. And for whatever you have, your opinions about China or the CCP particularly, what's happening to the average Chinese citizen, I think, is obviously very, it's terrible. And I think we should take stock of that. And largely, there's not many things I have a very overtly strong opinion about. I try to draw a degree of moderacy in my lining, but the CCP is not a group that I'm a fan of. And this comes from a degree. I wrote another Substack piece on this. You can find on it. But the CCP has had a degree of national pride in not taking foreign vaccines and not allowing Chinese nationals to take up foreign vaccines, particularly mRNA ones. The West has offered, other countries, not just the West, have offered vaccines. Even Russia has offered its Sputnik, which relative to the Chinese vaccine has been quite successful. And the CCP has refused them out of national pride, but also because they wanted to try and prove that their vaccines can work. So, until the CCP shifts in this positioning, I think you're going to see quite a lot of Chinese average individuals suffer, which is not good. And so, again, I'm not saying I know best for China, but I do think that if you've got a humanitarian situation where the spread of COVID across the country, rural and urban, and your vaccine clearly hasn't had the intended effect and the uptake has been questionable, dropping your pride and simply taking in foreign made vaccines, for better or for worse, is better. At the end of the day, also the Chinese could re-engineer or try and understand what the mRNA vaccines are, how they work, and then produce their own for better in the future. I think it's quite tragic what's happening in China at the moment, and it's going to have repercussions geoeconomically, geopolitically, and diplomatically as well. Very last point on China. There's been a huge array of concerns. We've had spaces on Clubhouse here, and I will be doing more on YouTube in the next couple of weeks on vaccine diplomacy and how countries have or haven't utilized vaccines as a leverage, as a incentive, as a coercive tool to get what they want, to get their interests shared or accepted. And China's vaccines have largely been rejected by international different nationalities. I could use Africa as an example. African states may have their resentments and anger with the West over colonialism and legacy, but largely speaking, when it came to vaccines, they were very much desiring Western-made vaccines. But the West was, well, this is the darkness of it as well, in that the West was stockpiling vaccines, obviously, to ensure that their own domestic populations were taken care of first. And so there was this huge desire by COVAX, the global, UN partially driven initiative to provide vaccines to other parts of the world, being rendered rather limited in its effectiveness because countries wanted to prioritize themselves over other countries. And so, to be really nerdy for a second, but it brings back this example of idealism versus realism in theory of political science or relations, in that in theory there are countries that preach the whole UN idea of we international cooperation, we work together, support one another, liberalism or liberalistic support one another, versus realism, which is that countries will put their interests first and foremost, their own survivalism, their own strategical interests, and that when push comes to shove in difficult moments like the vaccine diplomacy, you see these two sort of camps batting heads. And in this case, the realism came out on top because countries realized that, well, they could be altruistic and send their vaccines all to other countries across the world, but that would mean that they're in a potentially worse position of herd immunity and access to vaccines. So quite a lot of sensitivities and I don't know, commerciality is the right word, but difficulties around the creation, provision, and acquisition, if you like, of vaccines. But with that, everyone, if anyone did want to come up, now's your time. Thanks very much, everyone, for your comments. I don't know if I'd agree with you, Moneypenny. I don't think that Sputnik and Sinovac had less adverse events. The data around Sinovac is terrible. And as I said, it was rejected largely by many developing countries because clearly they didn't have faith in it. Sputnik is actually quite a good vaccine. There's just stigma against it because it's Russian and Russia invaded Ukraine. So people don't want to take that up. But Sputnik, for the places that it has been used, is actually, has been actually quite good. So I appreciate you on one point, but I don't agree with you on the other. Yes, Stephanie, I agree with you. The role of Hong Kong. Thank you for pointing that out. For those of you on YouTube, we've got a chat in Clubhouse as well, and people are showing me some of their thoughts on Clubhouse. Yeah, Hong Kong is an interesting enigma in that it's still very much China's centralized control of it very much now, but in specific areas, Hong Kong still retains a large degree of autonomy, and healthcare remains one of those areas where you still have quite Western educated public health officials sharing data research about the situation, and able to share that out in a way that China hasn't yet seemed to clamp down on or whatever. So some of the data coming out of Hong Kong is very different to that of mainland China, and actually reveals the manipulation of data that the Chinese Communist Party actually do, and sort of this weird mesh of Chinese dominated governance, but sort of in areas dissemination of information uninhibited from autocratic manipulation. And I think that the Communist Party are only going to continue to want to control and influence the role of data coming out of China. I think with that, I will probably wind up for today. Thanks to Jean and Stephanie for helping me troubleshoot a couple of things. Thanks to those of you who popped in. Really appreciate the support. If you haven't already subscribed to YouTube, on the bottom right button, and on Clubhouse, you can follow the house, the club, if you like. As I say, I tested this on an app called Restream, which is free. So you'll see Restream in the top right corner of the YouTube video. But I will probably be shifting to Zoom, or at least paying for a better stream as well until Discord can work. So I'll be, Jean, if you can resend me your email, that'd be great. Thank you. But yeah, I will be testing out a couple of things. I know there's quite a big lag on YouTube as well, or at least on this Restream version. So I'm thinking of investing in sort of, one of these paid subscriptions so that you can cross stream from a slightly better platform. Discord is free, but Zoom seems to be more reliable. So yeah, that's what I'll be doing in the next week. We've got an event on Monday, hopefully on some just updates regarding Ukraine. This is all via Twitter, but also we'll be restreaming on YouTube simultaneously. So we are shifting from these only being audio conversations to now being video. They will still be converted into podcasts. So if you enjoy the Global Gambit podcast on Apple, on Spotify, that will still be happening. I just took a couple of weeks off because it was the holiday season. So you can find the Global Gambit in any of your podcast directories. The latest episode we released was with Alexander Vinman, and I want to get him back on to have a more specific conversation about Western, Russian, and Chinese relations. We had a very wide-ranging conversation with him, but we're going to have that back on. We also were in touch with Lara Setrikian. She is a very, very well-known journalist who focuses on Azerbaijan, Armenia, and the Middle East. And I think she's got like 1.6 million followers on Twitter. But she was in touch because of another space we did about a week and a half ago on the Nagorno-Karabakh situation. And basically the Nagorno-Karabakh situation is very volatile. There's a very small area of land called the Lachin Corridor, which is being controlled basically completely by Azerbaijan, despite Nagorno-Karabakh being 99% ethnic Armenian. And this more broadly because Azerbaijan has heavily militarized in the past few years to take back land that it thinks it did lose out to from Armenia during a massive set of war conflict in the 90s. So there's a lot of concern around that. And then we're hoping to have a chat with Lara as well. But yeah, that's what I'm going to be doing from here on out, is having either a one-to-one interview with the guest or maybe a small panel where we have a more of a discussion, but then sometimes we'll have a debate. And so I will bring people on from different perspectives on a different topic, and they debate it obviously with civility and respect, but it's not just a discussion where we're sort of sharing the same perspectives. It actually, I act as a moderator, and we can actually have a debate with people on camera, because if you see people getting it's not the million marathon for those of you on Clubhouse, it's just people shouting at each other. It's actually a substantive conversation. Having a debate where you can actually see the guests, the speakers engaging one another on camera, it just adds that other degree of element of engagement and can make it that much more interesting. So we're going to be doing that. I will probably, once I find a more stable sort of connection where it's less laggy and hopefully the sound is more consistent, you can enjoy the video element much better. I'm going to be investing in a better camera and a better lighting situation, because I think quality is important and I like to provide good quality content. And I sound like a typical influencer content creator now. So click that like, subscribe button. Give us a thumbs up if you enjoyed this stream. I hate doing that. It's so cliche and uncomfortable. But yeah, anyway, thanks a lot, everyone. Much appreciated if you've been listening in for this episode. And look forward to seeing you on Clubhouse, on Twitter. You could just find me on any of those channels. On Clubhouse, you could just find Twitter on my profile. And if you're on YouTube, then yeah, you can find my Twitter on my on the bio page, and you can subscribe if you like. But anyway, with that, everyone, we've discussed Russia, Ukraine, we've discussed Iran a bit, we've discussed Israel, the US situation, a bit of wind energy, and also China. So try to keep this a wide array of discussions. Appreciate you all. Have a good weekend, and see you on the internet, I guess. Take care, everyone.